Let us look uh, in detail about the configuration files, whatever we have. So firstly, we'll have uh, the web.xml, strut.xml, which we already discussed right now. So no need to go in detail of that. Just a few things that uh, since struts.xml is required, we will have to create this file inside the classes folder. Remember this thing, right? So it is, if the classes folder is not present, then we have to create the classes folder inside the web.inf folder, and then we have to create struts.xml inside the classes folder. Remember this thing. Okay, that is the only thing we need to note over here. Okay, fine. Then regarding any configuration to be made, so we have the struts.config.xml file. So what all mappings or controller or whatever, I mean, if you are using beans, so for all those configurations, we will use the struts.config.xml file, right? And after that, the last file is struts.properties file, right? So for example, if we want to perform any modifications to the uh, struts framework in general, and those changes should apply to every struts project that we create. So in that case, what we have to do is we have to modify the struts.properties file. Okay, again, this file uh, we can create inside the classes folder. Okay, now what will happen if we try to create this file and make changes to the struts.properties file? Then those changes are going to be the default changes. I mean, those will be the default settings. Now, where the default settings for any strut application are written, it is written inside the default.properties file, right? And which is present in this jar file. Okay, when we include struts to core xyz.jar. So this default.properties file is then modified inside this jar file, and then those changes become the default settings for any strut application. Okay, just for the knowledge sake. Okay, these were the configuration files. Let us see about the action classes. So you know that by now, whatever business logic we have to implement, the business logic is to be put in inside the action class, right? Whatever action classes we need to design for a strut application. And uh, it is important from the perspective of transfer of data also, because any action class will be an intermediate class, right? And it will transfer the data coming from the user to the view component, right? So it is acting as the intermediate between the uh, client request and the view, right? Okay, that means it is acting as a interface between the controller part and the view part, right? Okay, which is the role of model. Okay, action must assist the framework in determining which result should render the view. So what this means is any action class will decide which of the result should occupy the view component, right? So that is basically decided by the action class. Whatever is computed and whatever is uh, used to show inside the JSP page, that means the view component, that is decided by the action class. Okay, fine. Now, as I told, in order to create that action class, we will have two methods. Either we will create our own action class, as we saw in the Hello World example, or we will have to implement the actions interface, right? Any action support class or action interface, whatever is provided. So in that case, uh, firstly, we will have to define the execute method. For example, if we are using the uh, action interface, like you can see the interface over here below, right? So the interface is having a number of string constants for each of the result type or interaction type, success, error, input type, login type, whatever it is. And then it is having a plain signature for the execute function. So we need to implement this execute function when we implement this action class, right? And execute method, as I said, it will have no arguments at all. Here you can see we have implemented action class by extending the action support class. Okay, so action support class, there will be an execute method, and we have defined, we have overridden the execute method over here according to our, according to the need of our strut application. Fine. Getter and setter methods are common. We have discussed it. Fine. Okay, let us talk about the interceptors. Now, if you remember, I told that interceptors are commonly used to perform the additional functionalities, or here what we call it as the cross-cutting functionalities, right? Before the data is submitted to the action class, the interceptors are going to perform any pre-processing, or after the result is computed by the action class, if any post processing is required, that is to be performed by the interceptor. Okay, again, exception handling or exception catching is one of the tasks which is performed by the interceptor. Okay, fine. So these, you can see these many interceptors are by default provided by the Struts 2 framework. uh, checkbox. So for example, if we are using the checkbox interceptor, then this is a this is a pre-processing interceptor. So what it will do, whichever checkboxes are selected from the form, so their value will be true, obviously. But those checkboxes which are not selected by the user, and then the form is submitted. So what it does is it changes the parameter value of those checkboxes to false. Okay, it does not keep it like that. Understood? So this is one of the pre-processing which is performed by the interceptor, the checkbox interceptor. Understood? Then if you talk about timer, so generally we want to generate some profiling information, right? How much time was required for a action class to execute. So we can use the timer interceptor and then calculate the total time which was required by any class to execute, right? So these are the general types of interceptors. Fine. How to create an interceptor? So, or not to create configuration changes we want to make, those are to be made in the struts.xml file. Understood? Now, for example, if we are adding the timer interceptor, or we are using the params interceptor, which we use to send the request parameters to the action class, right? So these two interceptors are to be applied to the struts application. So what we will do, we will add this tag to the struts.xml file, interceptor hyphen ref, and then the name of the interceptor, like params or timer, whatever we want to add. So these tags will be placed inside the struts.xml. Understood? Where it will be placed inside the struts.xml? Inside the specific action tag, right? To a particular action class, we want to apply these interceptors, right? So for every action class, we will have an action tag in the XML file. So in the appropriate action class, action tag, we will have to place the intersectors. I hope the idea is clear. Okay. What about the result types? So I told that there are three to four result types. Firstly, let us discuss about the tag which is placed inside the strut.xml file. I told you that results is the tag which is used to define every type of result. So generally, if you talk about any web application, let us talk about the the login user, use case. So in that case, we have these three possible outcomes. So for every possible outcome, we will have to write a resultant JSP page for successful login, for unsuccessful login, and maybe the account is locked in that case also. Okay, so for every action tag, we will have these types of outcomes at least. Understood? So for every action tag in the struts.xml file, we should ideally write these three types of result tags. Okay. Okay. But what types of results we can generate? So we can have three types of results. We can use the dispatcher result type. Right? By default, any result type for struts application is dispatcher result type. Okay. So what it follows, it uses that mechanism which you are aware of, request dispatcher or forward mechanism, right? So that request is forwarded to a given JSP page, right? It is not redirected, but it is forwarded. Okay, remember this thing. So in the result tag of the action tag in the XML file, you will specify the name as success, right? As I told, there can be three, four possibilities or outcomes. Here the name is success. Type you will specify as dispatcher, and then you will mention the entire link of the success page, right? Name of the success page is to be written over here. Then the second type of result is the free marker, right? Free marker it is. So it is a template engine basically, and we have to write a file uh, with an extension .fm. Okay, remember this thing. So suppose if you remember the outcome that we printed, hello world, and the name of the user, what was entered in the text field, right? So if we have to write a free marker uh, file, .fm file, then in that case we will write hello world dollar, in curly braces we will write the name of the input field, that is name itself, right? So that whatever data is put in that field, that will be replaced by this template. Understood? So name is the parameter which will be passed using the action, whatever action class we have defined, and that will get replaced over here. The third type is the redirect result type. Okay, so generally we use response.send redirect. The same mechanism is used, and here we are not forwarding the request, but uh, when we use send redirect, we are actually generating a new request from the current page or from the given location, right? So that is the difference between the two types. Remember this thing: request dispatcher dot forward and response dot send redirect. A new request is generated. So what is the advantage of this? If you want to add some data in addition to what data you currently have, so you can add that data and generate a new request. Understood? So that is why send redirect has a upper hand always. Fine. The mechanism which we follow when we are using the redirect type, so definitely in the type field of the result tag, we'll have to specify redirect as the type, and then using the param tag, we are going to specify the name of the success page, whatever it is, right? Uh, yeah, inside the for every possible result, we have to explicitly mention the param tag. This is important to note. Okay, fine. Coming to the validation framework, which is provided by Struts. Okay, now definitely we know that whatever validation is generally performed to apply some rules, right? So before the action class or any method of the action class takes over and it is executed, if we want to perform any validation, then we will use the validation framework. Okay, strut to validation framework. So we have a use case over here in which we want to restrict the age of the employee, and it should be between 28 and 65. Okay, then in order to do that, whenever we'll define the form, okay, inside the index.jsp page, we defined our form, if you remember, right? So in that case, we can uh, we can have a normal form. Here the change that you can see is we are not using the HTML tags like the form tag, the submit is not a tag anyway, the form tag and all, but we are using the strut tag library. Okay, and that is why you can see the prefix, whatever prefix we have mentioned over here, the same prefix is being used for all the tags of the struts tag library. So in the struts tag library, we have a form tag, we have a text field tag, and we have a submit tag also. So for using those tags, we have to put a prefix, whatever we decided over here. It is S. So a new way to define a form for the struts framework. That is the only motive. Okay, so this is our index.jsp page. Then whatever success page we have to design, again we will design that success page as success.jsp, and we are simply putting a line that employee information is captured successfully. Now, what user is expected to input? The user is expected to input age value. Okay, now that age value is to be validated, right? So we will uh, we will add a validate method. Already it is present. We will have to define that validate method. So we are extending our action support class. Okay, so that is the case. Moving ahead, if we have to validate, then in that case, we will have to put or we will have to use a function that is the add field error function. So whichever field error we want to diagnose, the name of that field is to be mentioned over here. So if you see here, the name of the field was age, right? So we are passing age as the first argument, and whatever error message we want to print, if the age is not even not given in the given range, then that message is passed as the second argument to this add field error function. Okay, so if the age is not given, not provided in the given range, then this message will be printed in the age field. That is the case. This is how we can perform validation in case of struts framework. Yeah, so this is the struts.xml file. uh, we will put uh, the result page name, and here to mention is we can also have the input as one of the types, right? So we can have the input for the result page, and we can provide the name of the input page, that is index.jsp, right? And one other page to show the success message, that is success.jsp. So this is the struts.xml file for the given validation example. Moving ahead, uh, localization. So we have already seen internationalization in case of AngularJS, if you remember last session. So the same concept of internationalization is implemented in the Struts framework, and it is called as localization, right? The meaning of both these terms almost is the same, right? So uh, if you remember, internationalization is nothing but we are adapting the application to the local language or local culture, right? So that process is called as localization in case of Struts framework, okay? And it is abbreviated as I18N. Just internationalization starts with I, ends with N, and in between there are 18 characters. So just for the knowledge sake. But how do we implement this localization or internationalization, whatever we call it as? So it is implemented through resource bundles. Strut 2 में implement कैसे होता है? So it is by using the resource bundles. Now, what is this resource bundle? So whichever languages we want to support in our web application, so we'll have to create a resource bundle for each of those languages, right? And that resource bundle will contain titles, messages, or any other text information in the preferred user language. Now that language is obviously selected by the user from the UI. Okay, we'll see the example, you'll be able to understand. Okay, so this resource bundle files will contain some key value pairs, and that will define your default language for the application. If you want to define your own resource bundle, then you'll have to create a .properties file, and what will be the format for naming that file? So it will be the name of the bundle, the language, and the country for that resource bundle. Okay, so for example, here you can see below, we've created a resource bundle for the English language, that too from the United States, I mean that accent. So we will have to create a file en_us, okay, dot properties. Understood? Okay. Then where we have to define the property files. I mean, for each of the language, we will have to define a property file, right? So whichever language it is supporting, for example, it is the default uh, English language United States variant. So we'll have to write global.properties. Understood? But if we want to use the French or Spanish local, so we will have to use global_fr or es dot properties. So all these property files we create, those many languages will be added to the Strut framework web application. Understood? So generally we see that all our government websites, you can see those websites use the concept of localization, wherein you can select the language, English, Marathi, Hindi, whatever it is, right? And then the layout of the page changes accordingly, right? So the same we are doing over here. So before we select any language, you can see the components are appearing in English language. If you select any other language like Spanish, you can see the form changes accordingly. Simple. So last part regarding exception handling. So how do we perform exception handling? Again, uh, any exception handling we can perform with the exception interceptor, right? So in Struts framework, exception handling is performed through the interceptor, which is named as exception. And you remember that there was an outcome called as error, right? So we can have a uh, error result page, and there this user will be redirected if any of the exceptions is encountered. Understood? So we will design the error page as error.jsp and put any of the error messages, whatever was required. And in the struts.xml file, we will have to mention the result tag, and the name will be error. And then we'll put the URL for the .jsp page for that error file, right? So this type of result tag is to be added in the struts.xml file. After this, so whenever we are present, uh, suppose if we are handling the validation and we are in the validate function of the action class, at that point we want to generate a error. So what we can write, we can return a error string constant, like we generated the success string constant, right? So in that case, we can generate the error string constant, and then the appropriate page will be loaded on the client browser. Fine. Finally, coming to the A notations. Now we know that what are A notations. Generally, if we want to add some elements or we want to include some jar files, so all of those can be done with the help of A notations in the in Java at least, right? So talking about the A notations in struts, so if we want to configure or if we want to add some uh, action classes, then we can generally configure the struts.xml file as we have done up till now. But the other way to add components or tags to the struts.xml file is by using the Java 5 notations which are used in struts framework. Okay. So to use these A notations along with the conventional jar files, we need to include some other jar files, and this is the final list of jar files that is to be included to support A notations, right? So what we did, we are using the same validation example in which the age should be between 28 and 65, and except the two functions, we are having the A notation as @int range field validator. So if any input field will have an integer value, then we will use this annotation function to validate the value of the integer field. Okay. Now, suppose we want to validate the age field. So we are specifying any message which is to be printed if the range is not properly given. So we'll specify that message as the first argument. The minimum value will be the second argument, and the maximum value will be the uh, third argument for this function. Now, what we have done, we have just replaced the validate function. Instead of using the validate function, we are just using the A notation in place of that. Okay. Now, what it will do, it will by default in the background, it will create the validate function. But we have just minimized that process. Instead of defining that entire function, we are using A notation. That's all. So these many annotation are provided by the struts2 framework, right? For example, if we are using the results annotation. So generally what we do, the number of results we want, the number of result tags we go on adding in the struts.xml file. But no issue. If we don't want to explicitly handle the struts.xml file, we will do that task from the by using the @results annotation. Okay, so for all those, like validating the email also, all those things we can perform with the annotation.